What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms deep state, oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy
the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning, and if you listened to our first few episodes, then you know that over the last few months, my friend Justin Higgins and I and our friends have convened hundreds of conversations, sometimes more than once per day with up to 30,000 live listeners and participants, where we hear directly from people who are in the news, in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of these conversations for the first time, and we are grateful to you for joining us. Today, we're releasing a recorded portion of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we hosted with U.S. Congressman Jim Himes and Ellen Nakashima, who's a national security reporter at The Washington Post. Ellen has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, including one for her work exposing the truth of what happened in the 2016 election, and Congressman Himes is a member of the House who's respected on both sides of the aisle and who knows a lot about what's going on in the world today. We talked about some institutions that really cut right to the heart of America today, where we are and where we're going. Congress, the judiciary, the media. How should they all relate in a free society? How is the U.S. different from authoritarian dictatorships around the world where all of that is much more fuzzy and much less accountable? Another issue we talked about was cybersecurity. The wall between the cyber world and the real world really starts to break down when you have cyber attacks on food, electricity, transportation, health, or election infrastructure. This wall especially starts to break down where you have conflict between states and where cyber attacks can mean people starve or freeze or face violence in the real world. We talked about how the international community is responding to this. What's the U.S. role in that? We also talked about what the U.S. is actively doing here at home, as well as around the world, to respond and defend ourselves, and where all of this is likely to go in the future. We had about 9,000 listeners in our live audience from all over the world, including some pretty serious cybersecurity experts who asked great questions, such as Katie Masouras, a pioneer and global leader in the area of cyber vulnerability, and Dimitri, the co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike. We hope you enjoy the conversation, and if you want to hear more like it, find out where to join us live, ask any of our upcoming guests a question, or share feedback with us, good or bad, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all of that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Ellen, we want to start with you. Can you give us a little bit of your background and why you were drawn to journalism?
Never had an idea of being a journalist until I actually graduated from college and walked into the college paper on a whim in the summer before I was going to go to grad school. And I got assigned a story, which was to interview the first Asian American female dean of a college, I think at UC Berkeley. I did the story, and the next day it appeared on the front page, and I said, hey, this is fun. And before I knew it, I had withdrawn from grad school and was working at the college paper. So that sort of whetted my appetite for the field. As I got into it, I thought I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. That was my dream. And I started, this was back in the 90s, in a more traditional way by working at a smaller paper and then up to a mid-sized paper. In fact, it was the Hartford Courant, a congressman in Connecticut. And that was a really good mid-sized paper at the time. And from there, got a job offer to work at the Washington Post to cover Metro News. Unfortunately, that's sort of working your way up to learn the ropes from a small to medium-sized paper covering cops, courts, schools, the urban issues, city issues, doesn't exist for a lot of journalists these days with the demise of so many good community and smaller and mid-sized papers. But however, I was fortunate in that regard and got to the Washington Post, where I was able actually to become a foreign correspondent in 2002 and got stationed in Southeast Asia with my husband, who is now editor on the foreign desk. And we were there for 4 years, covering everything from the Bali bombings to SARS, bird flu, and the Indian Ocean tsunami. Just a lot of issues going on in the region at the time. And then when we came back in 2006, I got put on the financial desk covering technology, privacy, and security. And that's how I sort of fell into, I guess, the combination of the foreign experience and then covering technology and privacy issues in the middle of the Trump administration moved me gradually toward national security. This was, an era in which we were in full-on war on terror, and technology was being utilized in many ways to try to prevent another big attack. And there were many significant issues that were arising from that. And cybersecurity, of course, became one of them. And so while I never set out to become a national security reporter, I sort of naturally gravitated toward that by dint of the sort of career path I ended up taking. And so, here I am today covering issues of cyber and intelligence and surveillance and national security. And it's a really sort of rich, rewarding, and always busy field.
Not only important, but probably going to be increasingly important as our society becomes more technologically dependent. So that's a pretty cool story. Thank you for that, Ellen. Congressman, I have two questions I'm going to wrap into one here. Can you kind of go through how you transitioned from the private sector, storied career there, into the public sector, like why that was appealing to you? And then the second question that we love to ask all of our members of Congress that come on to this show, so that if you're from the U.S. or if you're from somewhere else, you can get a feel for the man or woman that we are talking to. Can you describe Connecticut's 4th district to us and why, in your estimation, it might be the best district in the United States?
Great. Absolutely. And thanks for having me on. And it's great to be on with Ellen, who I have a ton of respect for. So to answer your questions, so why leave the private sector? I from when I was really young, I had a real appreciation for the power of government to make things better. Maybe, one of my very first memories was July of 1969. I'll let you do the math as to my age, but July of 1969, I remember on a tiny little 7 by 9 inch television screen watching a man set foot on the moon. And oh my God, I mean, for a toddler, just toddler plus, that was just an amazing moment, right? And I wasn't old enough to have appreciated the civil rights movement at the time, but I grew to appreciate that. And the more I sort of thought about as I was growing older, the power of government when it does things right, and that's a really important distinction because obviously it does things wrong, and that will come up in my story momentarily. I just thought, wow, that's that the government, when it does things right, can really transform lives, and not just civil rights. Sometimes when I go to schools, I hold up my iPhone and I say, "You guys know what this is?" And I say, you might wonder what the government does. It put the satellites into space that allow you to do location services. It actually was a government research program that led to the internet. And I go on and on about innovation and R&D and all that good stuff. What I didn't want to do was go straight out of school into government. I always thought it was a good idea if I was going to be opining on, regulation for the business sector, I'd actually know a little something about the business sector, say. And so I did spend about a dozen years in business and a number of years in the nonprofit sector doing affordable housing. Business in particular, great place to get trained. Really, really enjoyed it. Did not move my soul. I didn't wake up in the morning and think to myself, "Wow, I can't believe they pay me to do this." And so, I hit this moment in '07 where I just said, I'm going to lose this race, but when I'm 90 years old on my rocking chair, God willing, I'll look back and say, when the opportunity presented itself, at least I swung for the fences. And one thing led to another. Barack Obama, top of the ticket, that changed the electorate in southwestern Connecticut. And along the way, just to sort of fill in the tease I gave you earlier, early 2000s, I watched the government do some things catastrophically wrong. Right, the Iraq War, major strategic error, arguably the strategic error of our generation. The meltdown in 2008, the economic meltdown, which grew partly out of failed regulation. And I just thought the time is now. I should do it, and I did it. And the stars lined up, and the rest is history. But to answer the second question, why is the 4th District the best district? I'm not going to say it's the best district. I'm going to say it's a wonderful district. I actually, every time I travel this country, I'm always kind of amazed by its diversity and its amazingness and blah, blah, blah. What I will tell you, it's fascinating. And here's why. I have, first of all, we're kind of suburban to New York. A lot of people commute into New York. So you've got ready access to the greatest city in the world. And 10 minutes from home is beaches and mountains in which to hike, et cetera. But the reason my district is fascinating is I've got some of the wealthiest people in the world in southwestern Connecticut in communities like Greenwich and New Canaan and Darien. I also, right next to those communities, I have communities of immense poverty. The city of Bridgeport has a lot of poverty. I've got 3 cities. They're all pretty small. But that really, a day doesn't go by that I'm not in Connecticut that I don't appreciate the challenge that this country still has to make the kind of prosperity that is available to many available to more people, because I just see it every single day in my district. And it's people say, oh, well, aren't the desires of the rich at odds with the desires of the poor? No, not. I mean, sometimes, but not all that often. I think an awful lot of the wealthier people that I represent actually talk about the disparity that I'm talking about in a similar vein, which is we've got to do better. So it's just it's a fascinating place politically.
Thank you very much for kind of shaping the context a little bit of the 750,000 Americans that you represent. So now getting into the meat and potatoes, Congressman, could you outline from your perspective, you obviously have a ton of knowledge here, what are maybe the gravest threats to United States national security and also some potential opportunities for us?
What an interesting question. And the reason I say it's an interesting question, because if you asked me that question 5 years ago, or even a year ago, I would have given you a perfectly wrong answer. And what I mean by that is, we are still living through a brutal pandemic to which we lost hundreds of thousands of Americans. Globally, we're getting on towards 4 million people lost. And 2 years ago, I wouldn't have mentioned a pandemic. And yet now we've lost more Americans to COVID-19, I think, than we've lost in any of our wars. And 5 years ago, if you had asked me, I might not have said that our democracy would be stressed and put in peril, not by the Russians, not by the Chinese, not by Al-Qaeda, but by a right-wing populist movement that goaded on by a United States president actually attempted to, an insurrection against the Congress of the United States. I would have looked at you like you were nuts. So I approach that question with a fair amount of humility these days, because I would have gotten it exactly wrong. And that's, of course, one of the challenges of the field. So let me give the conventional answer, because because everything that I just said I think is true doesn't mean that it's also not true that we face very serious cyber threats. We see this every single day. And, by the grace of God, the worst that has happened so far has largely been, some gas lines associated with the Colonial Pipeline attack. But it could really be much, much worse. And, of course, wrapped up in cyber is the question of what is Russia doing? Russia is obviously a very malign and almost chaotic, almost, vandal type actor. Chinese are much, much more targeted in the way they mess with our networks. And you've got the rogues out there, as we ultimately saw with the colonial pipeline malware attack. So you'd have to put cyber at the top of the list, and then sort of all the conventional stuff. Obviously, we still spend a ton of time and energy and money on counterterrorism because we never want to see a 9/11 again. We worry about the traditional rogues gallery, North Korea, Iran, et cetera. One last thing I'll mention, because it needs to be addressed in somewhat unconventional fashion, of course, is the threat of being overtaken by the Chinese. And I really do mean overtaken. I don't mean that the Chinese are someday going to land, landing craft on New Jersey, but, they are now innovating. They are now near peer, as they say in the business, with us on technological issues. And if we don't really monitor that closely, the technological advantage that we've enjoyed since World War II will go to the Chinese. And, I don't believe that we should think of the Chinese as nothing but enemies. I actually think, that we have an awful lot of shared common interests with the Chinese, but we don't want to be second or third place finishers in the technology field when we're talking about things like artificial intelligence or hypersonic weapons or all of the things that you can sort of make yourself nervous about.
So I have so many follow-ups on points 2 and 3 that we could be here for days on end. But I wanted to ask you a follow-up before going to Ellen for a question. You mentioned the Colonial Pipeline hack with cybersecurity. We've had, in addition to that, in short order, the JBS hack, which for people in the audience was rogue actors, as the Congressman mentioned with Colonial Pipeline, hacking a meat production facility in the United States that represented a large portion of our meat production. And then finally, the last thing that happened or was announced in short succession was the solar winds, which, if I might be wrong, but I think that it's been attributed by unnamed sources and by our intelligence agencies to the state of Russia. So there are many ways we can approach this, but what are you and your colleagues in the United States Congress doing to mitigate our vulnerabilities to these type of hacks, both in the private sector and our government?
Well, great question. I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest answer, because there's 3 clear things that we need to do better. One of them is something for all of us. The other 2 are probably an area for government focus. But Ellen watches this pretty closely too, so I want to hear what she has to say on the issue. But the 3 things: number 1, all of us need to be much smarter about what they call our cyber hygiene. Almost all of these attacks succeed because somebody opens an email and clicks on a link, or doesn't have 2-factor authentication, or they haven't downloaded a patch. That stuff's not hard, folks, right? It's really not hard. And if we all do that, if we all show good cyber hygiene, this will go from being a huge problem to being a much more manageable problem. Okay, we know that. Number 2, this is really important. We need to do much more partnership between the private sector, which is often the target of these things. I mean, yeah, of course they go after CIA networks and all that good stuff too. But it blew my mind that when Colonial Pipelines had shut down their pipeline, it still was not clear that they were talking to the 3-letter agencies who really have expertise in how to address these things: NSA, FBI, DHS, et cetera. We need to say, guys, not a choice anymore. When you get attacked in your critical infrastructure, you go to the Department of Homeland Security, whoever, and you share, right? And that's sort of not optional anymore. And we're moving in that direction. And there's things you got to be careful about. You got to be careful about people's private information, absolutely. And then the third thing, and I feel really strongly about this, we need to do a better job creating a deterrent for this sort of thing. It made me a little crazy, and I expressed myself to senior levels of the Obama administration that the 2016 election hack led to the sending away of some so-called diplomats and the closure of a facility in Maryland. It was a slap on the wrist. And I was very pleased to see that the government recovered meaningful portions of the ransom that was paid to Colonial Pipelines. But I mean, we really need to do that and more, right? We need to start breaking people's computers and making it very clear. And I say that it's a very complicated thing, how you create a deterrent, how you do cyber operations. So I don't mean to sound flip about it. It's actually very complicated. But the point is, we need to, for the first time, start making it clear to nation states and to nation states that harbor rogue actors that if you do this, you're going to pay a serious serious price. Deterrence tends to work in these worlds, and we just haven't established a deterrent up to now.
Just to pick up on this idea of paying a serious price and breaking people's computers, recently President Biden was in Geneva talking to President Putin, and he handed Putin a list of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors that should be off limits to attacks and hacks. And they talked about, I guess, having consultations with cyber experts from both sides. Do you think having consultations is enough? And are you serious that you think that should the United States be threatening to break, Russian computers or hacking Russian pipelines if they carry out another sort of attack against one of our critical infrastructure sectors?
Yeah, great question, Ellen. And the answer, of course, is yes. And I probably should have mentioned that before I mentioned deterrence, right? Talking and establishing norms is really important. And you saw, but I bet most of America didn't see that just recently, the United Nations, I love this name, the Group of Government Experts, the GGE or something like that, released a report in, the usual nearly impenetrable UN speak. But it's important because a bunch of states, including China and Russia and the United States and a bunch of other states, got together and said, hey, generally speaking, we shouldn't attack each other's critical infrastructure. And yes, I do think that, Biden raising it with Putin, and I would hope he might, because, it looks like the perpetrator of the Colonial Pipelines attack was resident in Russia, would really push. So by all means, I always sort of joke a little bit and say everybody's familiar with the Geneva Convention. We need an ENEVA Convention, because if nothing else, why one of the many reasons that we actually didn't have a nuclear exchange with the Soviets and now the Russians was that we really understood how each of us thought about nuclear doctrine. We really understood, and we actually would have our senior officers meet and share protocols. And in fact, Open Skies Treaty, we could fly planes over their nuclear bases and they could do the same to us. And the whole theory was that we understood how we each thought about the use of nuclear weapons. And because we understood that, there was much less chance for misunderstanding. We don't have that in the cyber world right now. We don't really know what a military attack is versus a crime, blah, blah, blah. And that's why, Ellen, to answer your question in very long-winded fashion, those conversations where we sort of share how we're thinking about this stuff are really important to avoiding, catastrophe through misunderstanding.
Do you think that a threat of actually hacking in or breaking down someone's computer or having some actual impact or effect on their critical infrastructure is wise? Is it just? Is it something that would be pass muster in international law? And would it be effective?
Well, great question. There's no question that it's just, right? So, the laws of war have a series of parameters, if you will, as you know, humanity, proportionality, that basically says when somebody attacks you, so long as you abide by these parameters, it is just. The more challenging critique, and I know because I've had this fight with any number of senior administration officials, is, hey, wait a minute, we're more wired than the Russians. We're certainly more wired than the Iranians, and we're way, way, way more wired than the North Koreans, right? I mean, pretty soon we're in a world where everything is networked. And if we go and start, let's just, I hate to be snarky about it, but just for shorthand, let's just say if we go in and start hacking back and breaking computers or melting servers, they're going to do the same to us, and we're much more vulnerable. In the parlance of the professionals, our attack surface is much larger, and they're right about that. But when they shut down our fuel pipelines, I sort of said, oh, really? Okay, so you mean if they come after us, they might, say, shut down a fuel pipeline? And my point obviously was that, let's get it out of the way. Let's make it very clear that this stuff will be expensive. And it doesn't need to be breaking stuff. Look, we demonstrated as has become current knowledge that we can take people's money. We took the ransom back, or a good chunk of the ransom back from the outfit that ran the Colonial Pipelines Act. Let's do that. And again, I say this a little tongue in cheek just to be understandable because, this stuff is really complicated. But you know what? If a bunch of Putin's oligarch friends woke up and had a lot less Bitcoin than they had when they went to sleep, they might, the message might get through.
In your estimation, is that is that action, that recovering of the Bitcoin, repeatable, scalable? Is it something that the FBI is likely to be able to do with other victims of ransomware attacks?
So you're asking a question that sort of gets at the tactics used and methods, right? So I gotta not really answer that question except by saying that it worked, and it worked, I think, partly as a function of some technological acumen that we have, as well as like is always true in these situations, a couple of good breaks. So let's leave it there. But I'll just say it's not bad for the world to know that if you think that Bitcoin is a secure way to stow your ill-gotten gains, just remember what happened 2 weeks ago.
What about taking action to regulate cryptocurrency or ensure that offshore exchanges that deal in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency enforce, anti-money laundering rules that might take some of the anonymity out of these transactions? Do you have any thoughts on that? Is there something that the U.S. and maybe allies can do in coordination?
Well, yes, and coordination is going to be key, right? Because, first of all, good news. For the first time in a very long time, the Congress is actually sitting up and taking notice on this. And anybody who's ever watched a congressional hearing knows that my colleagues, there is some technological expertise, but let's just say it's not evenly spread through the Congress. And a lot of people are doing a lot of thinking, and we're having hearings and everything else. And so yes, that doesn't mean we're, by the way, going to pass legislation anytime soon. That's a tall order for us, even in better times than we're in right now. But people are coming to realize, and by the way, the cryptocurrency industry has some work to do here, because people are coming to realize that some cryptocurrencies can offer total anonymity. And who needs anonymity out there, right? It's the terrorists, the drug dealers, and yes, the libertarians. I get it. It's not necessarily all bad actors, but if you can move a lot of money around the world totally anonymously, that circumvents our ability to watch for money laundering, for drug proceeds, for terrorist finance, and that scares the bejesus out of my colleagues. And the reason I say the industry has some work to do is because an awful lot of my colleagues kind of scratch their heads and say, "Wait a minute, tell me again what's good about this thing, because I see a potentially anonymous thing. What's the good side of this?" Because sort of blinding us to bad behavior is probably not the best selling point. And so I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to see fairly aggressive proposals to maybe even prohibit totally anonymous cryptocurrencies like Monero. Bitcoin's a little more interesting, right? Because it's an open ledger technology. But yeah, that conversation is very much underway, and it has to be international, right? Because this stuff travels over wires. You can say we're not going to do it in the U.S. Well, how are you going to prevent folks from setting up cryptocurrencies in Switzerland or wherever?
Yeah, because my understanding is that there are these know your customer rules that exist in Europe as well as in the U.S. And for the most part, the government's enforcing there, but then there are still some states that don't have them, and these exchanges that operate in states that don't have such laws are often the ones that the criminals can go to and sort of launder the proceeds. So it is going to take an international effort.
Yeah, and the magic here, of course, like in so many technologies, is to not quash the innovation. Again, I'm still hungry for somebody to tell me exactly how is the human race going to be much improved by the existence of cryptocurrency? I've never heard a really good answer to that question, but it is an innovation and we don't want to quash it, but obviously we want to regulate it in a way that doesn't turn it into just a vehicle for very bad people to do very bad things.
So what about the role of sanctions, do you think, as a punishment and as a deterrent? In this case, okay, so we saw the United States impose some sanctions on Russia over SolarWinds. Justin mentioned SolarWinds earlier. We want to talk to you about that, about whether that was a sort of a wise and appropriate response. But first of all, do you think sanctions can be effective? Have they ever been shown to be effective in modifying behavior here? And Would you?
Yeah, there's a problematic answer to that question because the answer is sort of, right? I mean, you can hold up a couple of cases where sanctions probably achieved their desired goals. I mean, most recently, of course, really forcing the Iranians to the table to negotiate the nuclear deal. And arguably, back in the ancient days when you and I were in school, it's probably fair to say that sanctions had a pretty significant impact in ending apartheid in South Africa because it was so. But if you think about those two examples, the reason they worked, there's a lot of reasons they worked, but the key reason is that the international community was totally united, right? And so if you have a united international community, which, let's face it, you don't often have,
Right,
they
key.
can work. But if you don't, you're going to have lots of cheating, and sanctions can be pretty ineffective, right? I mean, it didn't stop the North Koreans from developing nuclear weaponry, and it's not stopping the Russians from bad behavior. And so it's sort of a problematic tool unless you have everybody on board.
Right. But the sanctions, even with the Europeans, haven't proven to change Russia's behavior, whether it's with respect to, using chemical weapons against opponents or aggression in eastern Ukraine. So what tool do you think would be most effective at actually changing Russia and Putin's behavior with, say, cyber attacks, malign cyber behavior?
Yeah, well, I hate to beat the dead horse, but Putin is a man who sort of understands the language of force and retribution. For him, international convention and negotiation is a tool towards the end towards his personal ends. And if it helps, that's great. And if it doesn't, he ignores it. So again, it takes me back to deterrence, right? Until you smack him in the nose hard enough, metaphorically speaking, he's going to keep sticking that nose where it shouldn't be. Sadly, I suppose it's uncomfortable that he's under sanction over, taking Crimea and his activities in eastern Ukraine, but they're kind of sustainable. So I think particularly in the cyber realm, the next time we see an attack that was either originated or tolerated, we need to, as they say down at the bar, kick some butt and take some names, because I think that's the only thing that's going to, at the end of the day, speak to him.
Right. Hey, and I know you mentioned solar winds. Now, that was really at bottom an intelligence and espionage activity, right? The intelligence community came out and said, we judge solar winds to have been an act of intelligence gathering, of espionage. It wasn't a damaging or destructive attack the way that, say, turning out the lights in Kyiv would be, which the Russians also did. And intelligence and espionage is something that the United States, all countries do, basically. So what was so bad about solar winds that it should deserve, such a strong response from the U.S., do you think?
Well, the answer is kind of obvious, right? Which is that intent is only part of it. And I think you described intent correctly. This was not something that was designed to destroy equipment or erase software like we've seen in other attacks. It was designed to get into software. But then you've got to talk about the effect, right? I mean, there's that old saying we learned as kids: the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? It actually created billions and billions and billions of dollars of damage around the world. And of course, the Russian intelligence agencies bear responsibility for that, just as we would. There's often an analogy in the kinetic realm, right? And if you're going after a terrorist and you kill the terrorist, but you also kill 50 civilians, you're responsible for that. And that's why we're very careful about how we take out terrorists when we do that. So intent is one thing. And you're right. We're never going to give up the United States is never going to give up its ability to do espionage, but we're still going to bear responsibility for what happens when things go wrong in the service of that espionage, just as the Russians.
Or in other words, we're never going to get the Russians to stop spying, but we can always call them out when we see it happen, right? I mean, you don't
right, and name and shame, and again, we're never going to give up spying, and the Chinese, nobody's going to give up spying, but you still bear responsibility, and we've seen this in other situations. It's hard to control software. Software that is specifically designed to get into other people's networks. If it gets out into the wild, it can wreak havoc, and
Yeah, I mean, in fact, and by that measure, SolarWinds was actually more limited and targeted than a much more, I think, disruptive hack, which was the Chinese hack of Microsoft Exchange servers. Do you remember that one
Right.
a few months ago? I mean, in that one, while it didn't hit U.S. agencies, it hit hundreds of thousands of targets, companies, state and local governments, think tanks, universities around the country and around the world. And one could argue that was far more damaging, disruptive, expensive, and it was directly attributed to the Chinese state. Shouldn't China maybe have been sanctioned for that one?
Sure. I mean, again, it's really important that there be accountability in this realm. I mean, an awful lot of the interstate, tensions happens away from people's living rooms, right? I mean, when we're doing uncomfortable things with the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea, people see it on cable news. Even a lot of this stuff is sort of abstract to people, but when all of a sudden you can't get to work, or the pipeline shuts down, or the electricity network is threatened, that's very real for people, and that's why accountability. And by the way, we'll be subject to the same accountability if we let something out into the wild that shuts down, Nigerian power networks. We'll need to help we'll need to help clean up our mess.
Ellen, this is for you, and then feel free to continue asking this question. You recently, sorry about that, somebody jumped on stage. You recently have done some reporting about what the Biden administration is doing at the international level with our allies and our friends and our brothers and sisters over in Europe. Biden administration is doing to address cyber as an issue, and whether you think those steps are in the right direction and maybe even going far enough.
Yeah, I think I did that reporting in response to the SolarWinds activity, which we just spoke about, and the administration, unveiled its response to both SolarWinds as well as the poisoning of Alexei Navalny and some other malign Russian actions as sort of a basket of bad behavior. And in general, the Biden administration is really putting a heavy emphasis on working with allies, especially in Europe, Five Eyes, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S., and Japan and South Korea and India, sort of trying to create an alliance of techno democracies, if you will, against what they call techno authoritarian states or autocracies, and trying to create this sort of coalition of the willing, of like-minded states who can bring to bear pressure on the authoritarian or autocracies to change their behavior, whether it's in the area of malign cyber activity or coercive economic activity, which is what China is engaged in, and we can talk about that, or other activities, and so whether it's through sanctions, coordinated statements of calling out bad behavior, sometimes indictments or law enforcement actions. I think they're definitely just trying to take this on in a much more international, global fashion than a kind of go it alone approach that the Trump administration engaged in.
Thank you for that. And I guess I'm going to ask one more question, then turn it over to Ellen, and then if she has any more questions, then we can go to the audience. So I guess, Congressman, to kind of zoom way back out, away from cyber and back into your business, and I'm sure Ellen actually has a ton of great insight on this as well with her reporting. During the Trump administration, we saw some really important investigations going on in both the Senate and House intelligence communities. In the Senate, you had Senator Mark Warner, who will be on this show in the future, working what was at least appeared, and the reporting was in a very close manner with his Republican colleagues, Richard Burr specifically investigating election interference. And then on the House side, you had what was reported to us as a more acrimonious dynamic. I was wondering if whether you can kind of juxtapose what we saw in the House and what we saw in the Senate, and whether or not the House Intelligence Committee can be as effective as the Senate committee, considering the dynamics that were publicly reported on.
Yeah, that's a great question and a painful question for me, because the echoes of the split that took place in the Intelligence Committee on the House side, which has always been the least partisan committee. We meet behind closed doors with no cameras, right? Nobody needs to pontificate for the cameras there. Is still very painful and still evident. I think Democrats regard Devin Nunes as very much sort of a handmaiden of ex-President Trump, and I think Republicans sort of regard Adam Schiff, the chairman, with whatever the symmetrical condemnation is there. And so it's really quite painful, because, of course, the committee has an absolutely essential function of providing some oversight to things that happen out there that nobody else gets to see. Ellen, of course, spends her days trying to see those things, but pretty much nobody else gets to see them. I don't know why the Senate was able to kind of keep its act together in a way that produced a bipartisan report about the Russian election hack, and the House wasn't. The House is a more rowdy place. There's a lot more members. There's certainly more aggressive activists in the House on both sides of the aisle, I think. But no, it's a huge problem. And it remains a problem to this day. It's starting to fade a little bit, but it remains a problem. And I think it's a credit, frankly, to Senator Warner and Senator Burr, and Senator Rubio, who ultimately signed off on a bipartisan report, which was quite critical of the Trump campaign and Trump administration, that they were able to keep, the sort of best interests of the country front and center on their committee activity.
Ellen, do you have any takes on the differences we saw?
I think it boils down largely to personalities. Devin Nunes, as Congressman pointed out, you had someone who was much more sort of nakedly partisan and political, and on the Senate side, the personalities were less so. And I mean, if you just contrast the chair and vice and ranking on the House side, going back, a decade, even though you had a Republican and Democrat, they as largely checked their parties at the door when they went into the committee to do their business, their party labels. And so, yeah, I think Devin Nunes was just much more of a political actor. And as a result, I think Chairman Schiff felt compelled to sort of, become more outspoken, and thus also, was painted as a very partisan person by the supporters of President Trump and the Republicans, and it just became kind of a very acrimonious, I think, unfortunately, environment. So,
and just to add some context, I have nothing but respect for the House. I was at LA in the House, and then I did some consulting for CISA at DHS. And for everybody in the audience, you may look at the House and you may say it's always all partisan, but for some context, the Intelligence Committee, I don't want to say never, but it's rarely partisan. It's normally, getting down to brass tacks, doing the business, putting the country first. And we saw a little bit of a breakdown there. But Ellen, I did want to, you're the two-time Pulitzer winner. I wanted to see if you had any questions for Jim, or if we should go to the audience.
Well, I wanted to just follow up on this. This is a great segue into something I know the Congressman cares deeply about, because generally national security, foreign policy, intelligence issues are nonpartisan issues, especially after 9/11. You saw that really play out. But the last sort of 4 years of the Trump administration, where you had a president who openly kind of disparaged the intelligence agencies or doubted their assessments of, for instance, election interference by Russia, and who put in place people who were seen as more, politically partisan, and then they were sort of intelligence professionals. With that, it took a toll, I think, on the intelligence community. And, morale was down and a number of people left or took leaves of absence. Congressman, what do you think? Has the change first in administration made a difference? And do you think, how do you ensure that politics plays no role in the profession of intelligence?
Yeah, critical question. Anybody who watches Donald Trump for 30 seconds very quickly comes to understand that facts that are uncomfortable to him, that don't fit his narrative, that don't make him feel powerful, are facts to be denied and ignored. Anything which damages his own sort of mental standing as this strong, maybe he wouldn't use the word, but autocratic leader is to be dismissed. And that was evident from moment one, when shortly after his election, he went to the CIA and stood in front of, what is the most sacred wall at the CIA, where the stars for those CIA officers that we've lost over the generations are put. And he talked about his big election win and talked politics. It was sort of clear what this president wanted. And as good as the people are inside the intelligence community, and by the way, they were not all good, right? What Rick Grinnell did at the ODNI, at the office when he was acting director of national intelligence, if it's not a crime, it should be. He was and always is a partisan hack who it's very clear he stopped the flow of intelligence that was inconvenient to the president. But my point is that institutions eventually are, they do move in the direction that their leaders want them to move. And so we're still in the process, I think, of being sure that the intelligence community gets back to a world where, analysts aren't afraid to say things that might be at odds with the president's policy, or that might be at odds with their own political leanings. Because when you start to say that intelligence can be used for political purposes, it's the Wild West. Where does it stop? And so we do have a lot of work to do. The current leadership team, I think, they don't get better than Bill Burns. Bill Burns he's a saint, right, at CIA, and Avril Haines at DNI. These are very, very careful people. And by the way, this isn't just the IC, right? This is the Justice Department. As we sit here and talk, I'm looking at a headline that says that, Attorney General Barr knew that the president's claims of, the big lie that he'd actually won the election were completely false. That's not the word in the headline. That's a non-family word. But, the Department of Justice was terribly warped by Attorney General Barr and others in the service of the president. And that's a terrifying thing. I mean, you need to go to countries, you need to go to banana republics, authoritarian caudillo-run regimes to see a world where intelligence agencies and prosecutorial authority is used for the political advancement of the leader, which is what happened in the last 4 years.
I do have to get your opinion on the reports from the New York Times, because we are talking about gross violations in the name of partisanship of the DOJ requesting records from your colleagues on the committee and the staff members. How do you feel about that? How should we look at that in the terms of the Constitution and potentially the executive branch maybe sending a message about investigating and oversight to an independent pillar of our democracy, the legislative branch?
Well, and the media, right? Ellen Nakashima had her. she can give you a firsthand account, but so there's a quick and clear answer to this, which is that it's yet another example of trying to bully institutions that did not line up for Donald Trump, that would not, tell lies for him, that would push against him. That's the definition, by the way, of the United States Congress. We're a check and a balance on the power of the president. Most people who have taken fourth grade civics know that. And of course, the media is exactly the same thing. The work that Ellen does is terribly important to keeping the government in line. And so here's the way I think about it. You can say, well, what if terribly important secrets made their way into the press? Wouldn't we need to go after whoever spilled those secrets? Well, yes, we would. And in fact, the press, generally speaking, and Ellen can speak to this, if a senior government official goes to the Washington Post or the New York Times and says, if you run this story, people will die, or there will be huge damage to our national security, they will often take the decision to postpone its release or whatever. They'll negotiate the information. But unless this is a case, unless this is, my colleagues who apparently had their cell phone records and text records, the metadata taken, with a member of Congress, unless you're pretty sure that member of Congress has $100 million in his trunk that he got from the Russians for turning over our nuclear codes, and I'm obviously giving you a cartoonish example here, don't do it. Don't do it, because there's just way too much scope, unless it is plainly criminal. Hands off, both the media and the Congress, because those are critical institutions to keeping our country from becoming the kind of autocracy that Donald Trump would have liked to have become. And I know I'm picking on Donald Trump. It's not just Donald Trump. These have been critical institutions for 240 years of our history to prevent us from drifting into totalitarianism.
And Ellen, to you, I know that the Obama administration also was guilty of going after journalist records. But could you give us your take on the question with the congressman? Because you, again, are the fourth estate here. Another, if not finalized in our Constitution, you are through free speech. If not a fourth branch of government, you're vitally important. What did you feel, and how do you view it through the lens of the Constitution when your records are so?
Right. Well, it is tremendously disturbing. It feels like a violation. I'd say this is not the first time my records were sought. Back in the Bush administration, in fact, George W. Bush, when I was overseas in Jakarta, it turned out there was a leak investigation into a story I had written, and unbeknownst to me, the Justice Department had obtained my phone records, metadata, not the actual content of the phone calls, but the who called who for how long information, the called metadata. And we were only informed of that several years later when the Justice Department Inspector General was doing an investigation of the FBI's use of exigence letters, which are not even subpoenas. They're basically just demand to a phone company that we are doing an investigation and we want these phone records. This is a leak investigation and we want these records, and they turn them over. So that was the first shot across the bow. That was a shock. And we got an apology from the then general counsel of the FBI to our executive editor. And then subsequently, when the Obama administration took office, they launched more leak investigations than all prior administrations combined, right? So it's not just, the Republicans or Democrats, it's both parties. But I think what the congressman pointed out is these investigations that started in the Trump administration seem to have much more of a political tinge to them, where some of these were questionable cases, maybe of trying to find out who leaked to a newspaper. In one case, I think it was the New York Times story. It looked like maybe they were trying to see if Jim Comey, then FBI director, had talked to the New York Times. I mean, that is a far cry from, say, an investigation into a national security leak involving a terrorist case or North Korean nukes. But it's never. I think as a policy, what I'm hearing out of the current Attorney General, that they are not going to seek journalists' records now. This is going to be their policy. They will no longer go after journalists' records. Is the right one, is a good one, because in fact, the press, the media are a crucial pillar of democracy. It's we are the journalists who try to help keep the American public informed as best we can about what's going on in the institutions of power, whether it's the executive branch, Congress, the courts, the intelligence community, or in private sector, and to hold people to account, right? To unveil abuses and hold people to account. And it is not a perfect. We're not perfect at it, but it is, I think, a crucial service to the public and a healthy, functioning democracy. And it's so chilling to sources when they are thinking or feeling that if they're trying to help the press understand what's going on, they could be, the subject of a leak investigation or a prosecution, and that is just, not conducive to a functioning democracy.
On that note, let's go to the audience. We've got about 30 minutes left here. And Ellen will stay as long as she can. She's on deadline. We want to go to Katie, who is a cybersecurity expert that's testified in front of Congress, and then Mr. Emerson for our first few questions. Katie, over to you.
Oh, hi. Well, thank you so much. And hi, Ellen. It's nice to hear your voice. It's been too long. So I guess questions for both Ellen and the Congressman. In terms of, I know the Congressman spoke of it's more complicated than that about deterrence in retaliation for cyber espionage, cyber attacks, or appropriate retaliation, proportionate retaliation. And I know you can't speak outside of the constructs of the Intelligence Committee on specifics. But one of the things that I really worry about as a cybersecurity practitioner of over the last 20 plus years is that we currently are not in a position to foresee catching up in terms of our ability to protect ourselves. So while, I understand that it is known that we are more vulnerable than a lot of our adversaries because of our reliance on the internet that we originally built, where is it that both of you, putting this out there for both of you, where is it that you see us sort of coming to terms with the fact that we are sitting on top of an indefensible cybersecurity infrastructure in the United States? And, at some point, the deterrence that we attempt, we're going to run out of runway, is, I guess, where I'm bringing this to. So either one of you want to take that question, I would love to hear.
Go ahead, Ellen. I'll follow you.
Well, I think that it's amazing how far, in a way, the country has come in the last 10 years, where cybersecurity was obscure, at a mainstream level 10 years ago, and it certainly wasn't something that CEOs and C-suite were thinking about. Cyber insurance really was barely there, and today there's just so much more awareness, for better and for worse, right, of the threats out there, of the need to, as the Congressman said, just do basic cyber hygiene, right? To keep patching, doing your updates. People are more cyber literate. I remember when I first started writing about these stories, I was banned from using the word cyber in the first paragraph, until my editors would say, you have to explain what cyber means, right? And today, of course, cyber is actually a very ambiguous word, but today it's on everyone's tongues. And there's more sophistication about the difference in types of attacks. As you know, there's espionage, there's destructive, there's damaging, there's influence or cyber influence operations that are carried out through the internet. There are different sorts of means or ends that bad people, bad actors try to achieve through cyber. So it's not just one type of threat that we are trying to protect against. And because of that, we have to raise our defensive game across so many different levels, and within, not just the general private sector, but the critical sectors. And, there's 16 of them, and each of them have varying degrees of expertise and sophistication as to where their defenses are. Whereas Congress is also starting to even think about maybe, regulation. I know the Homeland, or the TSA at the Department of Homeland Security, is working on regulation now, pipelines, which is something they would never have done even 2 years ago. Regulation seems like a bad word, but I think it's time to start thinking about that. And there's enough experience in certain sectors, like the bulk power, electric sector, in how to go about doing regulation, that it can be done perhaps in a way that's not counterproductive, that doesn't damage or depress innovation, that allows for companies to continue to evolve and use the newest and best tools. There's a very healthy, vibrant cyber defense and cyber threat industry. And one of the big policy issues is the degree to which U.S. Intelligence agencies and military agencies should be involved in defending the private sector, especially the critical infrastructure sectors, against foreign cyber threats. Because we have such a long and healthy, tradition of wanting to ensure separation between the intelligence agencies and the military and the domestic sectors. We don't want to have, the U.S. government spying on private companies and whatnot. There are challenges to just say allowing NSA to sit on people's networks. If you did that, it would probably make, maybe cyber defense easier, but it would make a lot of people very nervous about privacy and civil liberties. So I think that's one of the areas that is a challenge, but you keep hearing people raise that issue about how the U.S. government, the federal government, needs to be able to see what's going on inside the private sector a lot more than it can do so now. And that's because so much of the attack surface, more than 85% of the critical infrastructure, is in the hands of private companies. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and all I would add, I think that was a very good comprehensive answer. I would just add maybe something about how we think about this challenge. First of all, it's not a problem to be solved, right? I mean, these are, by definition, these are human engineered things. And if a human can engineer something, they can ultimately get into it. And so it's really a problem to be managed, and we can manage it. The good news is we can manage it a lot better than we do. Ellen's right. Actually, when I started in politics 12 years ago, Congress didn't know a darn thing about any of this stuff. And now people are very, very focused. The private sector is very focused, and we can manage it much better. We can do all the things that we've talked about with respect to cyber hygiene. We can engineer networks that are designed to be a lot more robust than they are. And then finally, you can take some comfort in the notion that, we've managed analogous problems before, right? Today, if you look at the cockpit of a plane, our planes today are fly-by-wire, right? It's all everything is electronic in the cockpit. It's not like the old days 50 years ago when everything was pneumatic and you moved a lot of things around and pulled levers. But planes use redundancy. There's a lot of redundancy, and in fact, if the electronics fail, you can always fail back onto, in many cases, mechanical systems. So that's the nature of the engineering that needs to happen in networks. And of course, our networks are, they change every single day as people install new hardware, new software. So you need to at least take some comfort in the notion that as we come to better understand the threat, we can better engineer networks that are not ever going to be completely protected, but which will be a lot less vulnerable than they are today.
First, we'll go to Dimitri, who was the CTO and co-founder of a company called CrowdStrike. Dimitri, do you have a question for the Congressman?
Sure, and Ellen, good to see you here. Congressman, two-part question. One is, what do you see as a prospect for passing some critical legislation this year, like mandatory breach reporting, given the disclosures we have seen on SolarWinds and other issues, and companies have just not been forthcoming on disclosing that they've been victimized, and unless they can show that personally identifiable information was stolen, there's not really domestic regulation at the state level that would force them to disclose. So that's number one. And then number two is organizational question. Congress passed last year in the NDA this new position, National Cyber Director, located in the White House, although not on the National Security Council, sort of as a one throat to choke, as some of your colleagues have described it. But at the same time, we already have a lot of people that are in charge of cybersecurity in the government. We obviously now have Ann Neuberger, who's Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber, that's running things at the White House already. We have the CISA Director. We have the Director of NSA and Cyber Command and Director of FBI, all of whom have a variety of different roles in cyber. So are we just creating more bureaucracy and adding people to this issue versus creating a one throat to choke type of accountability? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions, and I'm sort of humble about answering them for somebody who is critical at a place like CrowdStrike. But let me take a whack at it. Number one, your question was, are we going to pass legislation? The answer to that is yes. I can't tell you whether it'll be this year. There's an awful lot on the plate this year with infrastructure and budget and debt ceiling and you name it. So I don't know that it'll be this year, but I will tell you that the weather has changed pretty dramatically on this. I went through the CISA Act. That was, I think it was 2015, and it just took forever, and it was negotiated. And the CISA, I believe it was Computer Information Security Act. It set up this mechanism for the private sector to go to the Department of Homeland Security, and they were given some protections in case they inadvertently passed on personally identifiable information. That was quite a slog, and so these issues are challenging. But I do think that the weather changed on things like mandatory reporting. I wasn't the only one in the Congress who said, "You've got to be kidding me. We don't even know, the nature of this attack. We haven't seen the malware, and by the way, we don't know whether a ransom was paid." I mean, many of us read about this in the press, and so yes, I think there is a new urgency, and I would imagine that sometime in the next year or so, we will probably pass legislation expanding on the CISA, the Act of I believe it was 2015. Then you get into much more complicated areas, privacy, right, which is adjacent to what we're talking about here. That's going to be a bigger slog because there's just people very adamant on both sides of that issue. With respect to the management, the interior management, I candidly don't know the answer to that question. I've observed that in the federal government, when you have cross-cutting issues, a lot depends on the people that are in the organizational roles as opposed to precisely where those roles are. Are they in the NSC? Are they in the White House? Are they at DHS? Or I think back to when pre-Trump you had a DNI and a CIA director who had worked with each other forever, and consequently what could otherwise be sort of a little bit of a source of some tension worked really well. So I think the magic lies in the people. One comment I would make, and again, I'm on a little bit thin ice here because I haven't actually gone in and sort of done a deep dive in probably 2 or 3 years, but one thing that the federal government needs to get better is making sure that good cybersecurity practices and updated hardware and updated software permeate throughout the departments and the agencies. When I last sort of did a deep dive on this 2 or 3 years ago, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Treasury, they all had their, the secretaries were captain of the ship, and their authority was, unbreachable, and they all had a chief technology officer whose authority was unbreachable. And there struck me as very, very little communication between Treasury and Agriculture and OPM, for example, which is a little crazy, right? Because it turns out that these departments and agencies actually in some cases share hardware. And so it does strike me that somebody who has a DNI-like perspective, Director of National Intelligence, who can look across 17 agencies in the case of the DNI and say, hey, what we learned over here at NSA really needs to get, shared over here at, the Treasury intelligence operation. So that's a long-winded way of saying I'm not really sure if the answer is right, but I do know that we still in this area of cybersecurity and generally speaking IT need to do a much better job sharing best practices across the agencies and the departments of the federal government.
I want to go to my friend here, John Soss, who was an intern for Ted Cruz, actually, on the Hill. Do you have a question? And then after John, we will go to Neely for maybe a more business angle.
Oh, Justin, if you were looking for someone that wasn't going to do the business angle, you went to the wrong person here. But Congressman, thank you for the time. A lot of interesting stuff happening this week. What with the kind of closing of the EU Foreign Policy Summit, we got the Putin-Xi meeting this week. But the thing that's actually drawn my attention is the Eagle Act kind of going through the House at the moment. That includes the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That would, for the audience's sake, it would kind of require companies to prove out the supply chain didn't include forced labor. And my question to you is kind of twofold. The first is, I'd love to get your thoughts as to whether or not this is going to clear the House, since I think the Senate version has already gone through. But more importantly, how difficult is it being on the intelligence community to effectively communicate with sort of your compatriots both in Europe and elsewhere abroad to ensure that a lot of these sanctions and rules that are being implemented by the U.S. actually have the kind of teeth that's necessary. Can you kind of walk us through your engagement with them on the sort of across the pond?
Yeah, great question. Great question. And, in terms of the sort of congressional efforts around really calling out and naming and shaming the Chinese with respect to their atrocious activities with the Uyghurs, I do imagine we're going to continue to make progress there. There's not a lot of dissent inside the Congress about the need to really highlight the awful things that are happening that the Chinese are engineering in that region. And so, yes, I haven't actually reviewed the specific language, so there may be things that are problematic. Internationally, it's much more interesting, and we sort of saw this at the G7 and within the EU foreign policy conference, which is that it's a bit there's a parallel to be drawn with Russia, right? Everybody's angry at Russia, but oh, by the way, they're building several important natural gas pipelines. There's an analogy with that with the Chinese, and actually it's important because, as I said earlier in this presentation, we need to resist the temptation of thinking of the Chinese as nothing but enemies, right? I mean, they own trillions of dollars of United States Treasury debt. They are critical to all of our supply lines. And you see that, of course, in the international response. And you saw this at the G7, where some countries wanted to take a much more aggressive approach with China. And, China will exact retribution from those countries that, particularly those countries that aren't as powerful as the United States, that call the Chinese out on their bad behavior, whether it's in with the Uyghurs or domestically with the press, et cetera. And so, yeah, there is always going to be, I think, a robust conversation in which it's frankly going to be easier for us. It's going to be easier for us as the United States. We're a global superpower. Though our supply chains are intimately linked, we are not as vulnerable to Chinese coercion as, let's say, the Malaysians are. And so, it's going to be easier for us to say, hey, everybody should do this. But, I remember Madeleine Albright at one point as she was talking about how we had to think about the Chinese. She said, it's the very definition of statecraft, right? We've got to remember our values. We've got to be intelligently coercive where we have to be, and we have to work really hard to build these international coalitions because, obviously if the Chinese see the world as divided and something like the way they treat the Uyghurs, they'll see that as reason enough to keep doing it.
Thank you for that. I think Christine is actually involved in cross-border investment. She's a Taiwanese American. Christine, did you have a question that might be related?
Yeah, Congressman Himes, thank you. So my follow-up to that would be, how do you balance years ago to facilitate private sector investments from China, students, tourism, things that are adding to our economy here? And, I follow U.S.-China kind of triangle on a government level very closely. But there is concern with being able to differentiate as a country with this kind of increased anti-China sentiment that I feel between the actions of the CCP government and being able to continue having our states benefit economically from the trade. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on how you're balancing that.
Yeah, another really good and difficult question to which there's no quick answer, but I'm going to try to be quick so we can get more questions in. The magic, I think, resides in hopefully working with the Chinese and maybe even persuading the Chinese to be much more clear about where the CCP, where the Chinese government starts and ends, and where the private sector and academia starts and ends. And I know that that's a huge issue because they don't necessarily think about it that way. But if academic exchanges are at some point driven primarily by the, foreign ministry or the Ministry of Interior Security, and we have reason to believe that academic exchanges are in fact sort of, about either, proselytizing to Chinese abroad or trying to come by IP at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, it's going to be a much, much harder problem. And of course, that goes for just about everything. It goes for Huawei. Wouldn't it be neat to have much more clarity into the relationship between the CCP, the Chinese government, and Huawei? We'd make at least a huge problem much smaller. So the best I can do, because this is, again, it's not a problem that's going to be solved, is to suggest that verifiably speaking, the Chinese, it would really help if they would be much more clear, because we do whole of government response, right? They do whole of society response. And so it's hard for us to know when we're talking about the exchange of students or the exchange of academics or investments in our, venture capital like investments in our high technology firms, whether we're dealing with the interests of the Chinese state or the interest of an investment or a university, et cetera.
Thank you for those questions and quick answers. We're going to go to Neely and then Emerson. Neely, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Congressman. Himes, the question I have for you is, we've got economy and jobs, we've got education, and often I think we kind of approach them in two separate silos. But the reality is we are only as good as our labor force. And we're seeing a lot of that kind of come to like wallpaper ripped off a wall. We're seeing a lot of those cracks right now in our economy. How do you think we can more effectively align the interests of where we need to be in education with the interests of corporations?
Wow, great question. Okay, I have to do it disservice by trying to be relatively quick about it, but you put your finger on it. I wouldn't use the word corporations. Corporations are just one legal entity that employ humans, right? Small businesses do, academia does, blah blah blah. The way I'd rephrase your question is to say, how can we finally innovate enough into our educational sector, which has been famously resistant to innovation, so that it is producing people who can take the jobs of today and tomorrow quickly and in real time, because that's not what we have today, right? We're still stuck in the world. I certainly have a piece of paper that I got, whatever it was, 30 years ago, that said I graduated from a college, and I've done a little bit of sort of continuing education along the way, but the idea that you get a piece of paper and boom, you're done is nuts in the modern world. So what does that mean in an effort to be to be brief here? We really need to rethink education into something more akin to lifelong learning, because it's not just the guys who used to work down at the plant on the industrial lathes anymore whose skills need updating constantly, right? It's everybody. It's accounting, it's software developers, it's more white collar. So we really need to migrate into a world where education is truly a lifelong endeavor. And that opens up some pretty interesting possibilities, right? We all just went through a year where we saw, our kids, students, learning, doing distance learning, right? And we learned some things that work and some things that didn't work. But my point is that we really need innovation in the sector. 4 years. What's magic about 4 years? Absolutely nothing, right? There's plenty of people who can be really well trained and can be great civically minded American citizens, maybe with 2 years, maybe with 3 years, maybe with 7 years. And so I wish we had another hour to devote to this, but until we really rethink and innovate and disrupt our system of education, we're going to be right where we are today, where we have a lot of jobs that are going begging, and we have a lot of people who don't have the skills to take those jobs.
I wish that during the hearings, more members of Congress, like Congressman Jim here, got the headlines, because he's pretty damn good at answering these complex questions very quickly. We will go on that note to Emerson. Over to you, sir.
Hi there. Hi, Keddy. Long time no hear. Quick question for the Congressman. There's obviously a conflict between having the defensive mission and the offensive mission inside the National Security Agency. Has there been any thought given to splitting those missions out? Because it has been painfully clear over the last years that the offensive mission consistently wins in those internal debates. Over to you.
Yeah. So I would tell you that the division is now fairly bright lined. The NSA is not, generally speaking, an offensive agency charged with operations. That is Cyber Command's realm. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that they live in the same building. And what makes it a bit challenging, of course, is that, the skills involved in exploiting extremely well-protected networks, these are not things you buy down at the local 7-Eleven. There are a very limited number of people who actually have that deep expertise. So yes, there does tend to be, and this may be why it's good to have them in the same building, there does tend to be a lot of people sitting sitting next to each other in front of screens when this sort of thing happens. But more and more there is an increasingly bright line between those two operations. And then I think you're referring to a conflict that is just plain hard, and we're never going to solve it. We're never going to come up with an algorithm that solves it. And that is when we find a vulnerability in some piece of software, what do? Do we let the world know about it so it's a safer world, or do we keep it secret so that we can actually employ that or take advantage of that exploit against whoever it is we want to take? That is a really hard problem without a clear answer. There have been cases, of course, in the last couple of years where the NSA has very, very publicly gone out there and said, we found this vulnerability. But that will not necessarily be the decision in each case. And that's just, again, I'm not sure there's any organizational structure or anything else that solves that problem for us, because it's always going to be profoundly competing demands on what happens when we find a vulnerability in some piece of software.
So we're going to go to Rebecca and then his constituent Erica for the last two questions here. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Congressman. It's so great to have you here. I wonder what your thoughts are on how we protect voting rights. It feels to me that this is a crisis facing our country and that voting rights are under attack. And I wonder what you believe is the right course of action to return this issue to bipartisanship.
Yeah, great question, Rebecca. I mean, look, the Republican Party has realized they looked at what happened in Georgia, where we elected a black man and a Jewish man senator, and both Democrats, and they drew the fairly clear conclusion that when you have very, very substantial numbers of people voting, they don't tend to do well. And now, some Republican will offer the rebuttal to that in a future thing. So what do? They manufacture this notion because there's just not a shred of evidence that there is lots of potential or real voter fraud out there, and therefore we're going to do all these crazy things like trim back on the various mechanisms that were opened up to make it easier for people to vote in COVID. Then they do some outrageous things like taking away sort of authority from nonpartisan secretaries of state or nonpartisan entities and handing them to legislature. I mean, look, we all know what's happening here, but your question was, what do we do about it? Number one, we have to fight it legislatively everywhere that it happens, and we're not always going to win because there's lots of states where Democrats don't really have a say. Number two, the Department of Justice needs to do what it announced yesterday, which is that they're going to go after Georgia. They're going to sue. They're going to try to show that Georgia is deliberately trying to disenfranchise voters of color here. We are going to rely on the courts a lot. The courts actually in the last 10 years or so, the courts have done a lot of work turning back state laws that are pretty clearly designed to disenfranchise Americans. But that's not going to be adequate to the incredible campaign of disenfranchisement that the Republicans are running around the country. We're going to need to ultimately, when Democrats have more of a say in some of these state legislatures, reverse legislation. And then finally, and this touches close to home for me, we have a say too. And by we, I mean people who believe that Americans should vote. And I don't just mean Democrats. We need to make sure that in November, we go into these communities and say, there is huge money and huge effort being expended to keep you from voting. Let's show them wrong and do the traditional field work and voter ID and voter pushes that will cause people. And I think they will. Look, African Americans are very conscious of the fact that that for generations now they've been subject to all sorts of all sorts of things to try to deny them the vote. And that can be motivating, right? That can really be motivating. And so we've got a lot of organizing to do on top of all the other things that I talked about. But it's really essential. I mean, it's just terrible to imagine that a political party would say it's better in this country if fewer people vote. And they may not say it that way, but that's what the Republican Party is doing today.
Erica, you're in Connecticut. You're probably not too far from the congressman right now. I love that you're a constituent and you get to ask the member of Congress a question. Please bring us home here.
Oh, thank you, Justin. And thanks for being here, Jim. I really appreciate it more than anyone here because I understand. And thank you for doing the Juneteenth in Bridgeport and in Easton. I have a background. I interned in Hartford and was involved in local and state politics. And even back when Senator Blumenthal made the transition from AG to Senate. And I read the piece in the Post on January 6th with you and Delora and Dick. And I guess the reason I voted for you, in large part, not only are you intelligent and everything you stand for, but your Peruvian background. I'm also an immigrant, so which brings me to Bella, your beautiful dog, which is also my niece's name, and those who are immigrants know that. So I'm going to ask you probably a little more personal connection, and you can take but how did that, being an immigrant, influence your your involvement in politics, what you do, even cybersecurity? How did that inform that, and what should we take away as other immigrants are in the audience, as other immigrants and constituents in such a diverse state as Connecticut? What would you like to say to that, or what can you speak to?
Yeah, gosh, what an interesting question. Thank you, Erica. And I'm so delighted to be able to finish with a question from a constituent, and such a good one as well. I should probably clarify, I'm not actually an immigrant. I spent the first 10 years of my life in South America. I was born in Peru. My father's North American, and he was working down there when I was born. So I can't claim to have had the full kind of immigrant experience. But I can tell you this. I was in South America, in Peru and Colombia, until my parents split up, and my mom brought us back to the United States when I was 10. And a couple of neat things about that. One, and boy, that's the way to learn a language. I will tell you that. Having tried to learn a language in high school as well, it was a wonderful way to learn a language as a baby, essentially. But the real answer that I want to sort of close with today is, when I was a kid in Peru and Colombia, there were military dictatorships in those countries, Peru in particular. There were coups, there were soldiers and tanks and machine guns on street corners. And when I came to the United States at age 10-ish, none of that was there. I really felt freedom, right? I could play in the street in the town that I lived in. I couldn't do that in Bogota, Colombia, right? There was all sorts of fear of violence and kidnapping. And so I'm profoundly grateful for what this country offers people. And that I think is at the core of a lot of immigrants. And again, I didn't have a typical immigrant experience, but I think that's really at the core of the way a lot of immigrants feel about this. And it's important to say that because we're having this big argument that I think is largely sort of fostered by the right wing today. Another one of these ways to, take attention away from the fact that when the right wing is in power, what they do is they cut taxes for very wealthy people. That was the sort of major policy achievement of the Trump years. We're having this whole sort of discussion about critical race theory and this and that. And to me, it just feels like such a silly argument, because just as human beings, we should be proud of what we do well. We should also be very honest when we make a mistake and apologize. I think there's a metaphor there, right? To the core of my being, I feel enormously grateful to this country, and I'm beyond proud of the progress that we have made. And we have made very real progress because of people like my friend John Lewis. Don't ever tell me that John Lewis didn't drive incredible progress in race in this country, and Martin Luther King and others. And all caps, AND, we have a long way to go. And we should be able to acknowledge that we have in the past gotten it wrong from time to time. For every winning of the Cold War and the freeing of an awful lot of, the globe from Soviet oppression, there is a Korematsu where the United States decided to take American citizens of Japanese descent and jail them, profoundly contrary to our Constitution. There is Jim Crow. We'd be so much better country if we thought of our country the way we think, I hope the way we think of ourselves, which is let's be enormously proud of our achievements and of what we strive to do, even as we recognize that there are things in our history that are appalling that we should struggle with, if for no other reason than history does tend to repeat itself, and we should be conscious of that, and apologize for those things. We should all feel badly about what was done to Japanese American citizens in World War II. We should all feel badly about the generations of murderous racial prejudice that we still see echoes of today. So I just wish we could have that conversation. conversation rather than this silly conversation of, are we a country we should be proud of, or are we a country that is, irredeemably rooted in racism? Both of those points of view are just completely inconsistent with the reality of this country, and it cheapens us as citizens to not acknowledge the full, what's the right word, comprehensiveness of this country's history. Which, again, to come back to your wonderful question, since I was sort of naively brought to this country at age 10, I just had a little bit of a perspective on that maybe you don't if you grow up maybe taking it for granted.
It appears that is all we have for you today. If you liked or disliked what you heard, if you want to find out where to join us live to listen or maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or if you have any feedback for us, good or bad, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founder Justin Higgins and I and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.